Okay, I'll continue. So, just in terms of disclosures, just to let you know that my first 39 years were in Melbourne, in Australia, and I was 3 chapters into my PhD when I was recruited to the University of British Columbia in Canada. So that might help, kind of explain the accent. And also, it was interesting because when I was recruited to Canada, it was a 2-year contract, and it's now 20 years later. And so I just think that probably shows how patient the Canadians are. We've been really, really lucky being able to build the men's health research program at the University of British Columbia. We do focus on men's mental health, and specifically depression and suicidality has been our mainstays. We've done a lot of work in male smoking cessation, a ton of work in prostate cancer, the psychosocial aspects of that. And we do a bunch of other work in men's health that's driven by our graduate students that come to us from all over the world here. So it's been a great ride over the last 20 years. I do want to acknowledge that the data that I present today is from Canada and it's from Australia. So I actually hold joint appointments. I do full-time work here at the University of British Columbia, and I do a day a week at the University of Melbourne in Australia. So I'm presenting things from that context, and I'm always aware, as being someone from out of town, that I want to try to offer some insights, but by no means do I know your full context, but I hope some of what I say today resonates with you. I've got 24 deliverables in 50 minutes. I won't belabor the list here. It's a little bit of a pulp fiction. These things kind of fit together, hopefully. The order of them can be a little bit all over the shop, but bear with me. It can be quite helpful to sort of think about the 360 degrees that is in and around men's depression and suicide. I want to start with a story. So it's 1969. I'm in my 6th year, and I'm at a town hall, and I'm about to graduate my grade 1 class in a mining town that's aptly called Broken Hill. And I'm living in Australia at this point. I'm there with my mother, and there's these stairs which I'll have to walk up when my name is called to receive my certificate for my grade 1 graduation at Broken Hill. So the names are called alphabetically, and I've had well-documented challenges with arithmetic, the alphabet, math, pretty much everything at this point. Really haven't tracked very well as a scholar, as a young boy. And so the guy starts reading out, Mr. Jenkins starts reading out the names, and one by one, my classmates go up and get their certificates. He gets into the Michael Noonans, the Olivia Ottos, and all of a sudden I realised that I should have probably been between those two names, alphabetically. And what continues on is a list of all the people in my class as he calls them up and they graduate. I sort of turned to my mother and I sort of said, how come my name hasn't been called? And she kind of ignored me pretty much. And the kids continued to get called up on stage. Everyone got their certificates. So I didn't kind of cross the stage that day. And Miss Trudy, my teacher, made her way across to me after the event. And she said to me, I hope you have a really good Christmas, John. It was a pleasure having you in the class. And I couldn't really lift my eyes to sort of meet hers at this point because I was pretty upset about the idea that I've failed grade 1 in Broken Hill. So the drive home with Mum in the Morris Minor was pretty quiet, but I did sort of ask a couple of times what might have happened. Had there been some sort of clerical error that I hadn't passed, or my name hadn't been called, like what had actually happened. Really got no idea from Mum. She sort of kept pretty quiet on it. Dad came home about a month later. He'd been working away, and he said, look, we're moving from Broken Hill. We're moving to a place called Adelaide in South Australia. So it's interesting. When we moved from New South Wales, where Broken Hill was, to Adelaide in South Australia, they had a different school system. And miraculously, I was put in grade 3 after having failed grade 1 in Broken Hill. And I was forever the guy up the back who really wasn't getting it, wasn't doing real well with school. Why do I tell this story? I tell it not to dampen your expectations about my presentation that's coming up, but it's to say we protect boys from vulnerability all the time. And we protect them in the hope that they'll get some resilience and that they'll say the things that they need to say and share the things they need to share. And oftentimes what we do is we shut guys down. And it's interesting at the moment, so many men are breaking the code and talking about mental illness. A lot of successful men. And we sometimes we simplify the matter and we sort of tend to think that guys, as long as they speak up, are going to be okay. But there is a really strong discourse that silences men, and it's alive and well, just as it was back in the 60s. And this from 2022, and it's a letter to the editor for the New York Times where they're talking about petulant vulnerability. And by that, they're saying petulant vulnerability feigns emotional fragility as a means to retaining power. So there's this kind of a little bit of a gender war going on at some level around, why men disclose what they do. And I think it's a really unfortunate period of history where there's a bit of a push and shove around whether men should disclose. When I thought we made really good gains, there's also these challenges about how men speak up. Our work for the longest time has talked to stigma, and it's talked to suicide and depression literacy as issues for men. So these couple papers out of the 2016 mark, they talk to the idea that guys, who had experience with depression and suicidality, they were far more likely to be embarrassed about going and seeking help when compared to females. And it was a Canadian representative sample, population representative sample. Same could be said, in terms of literacy. Men had a really hard time differentiating depressive symptoms and factors that were related to suicide. So again, this notion that it's as simple as getting men to speak up, it ignores the discourse and some of the hard work that goes on for guys, some of the things that they bump up against. Amy Chandler does some great work out of the UK that talks to this at some level. But just to say, every time I feel like the stigma and the literacy might be getting better, there's always something pushing back on it. And it's still a consideration, a key consideration in men. We started back in the early 2000s. We had what we believed is a discordant relationship between men's low rates of diagnosed depression and high rates of suicide. And we were mighty interested in why that would be. We've done a lot of work where we give cameras or now people just take their phones and they take photographs. But we interviewed a ton of guys around suicidality and we asked them to take pictures of their experiences of suicidality. And we came up with a little theory about what happens with guys. And I'll share it with you. It's injury, interiority, and isolation. So this from a 21-year-old man, and his parents have divorced and separated, and neither one of them expresses an interest in having him live with them. And then he goes on to have a relationship of his own, which ends up breaking down. And he takes this picture of an abandoned apartment, condemned, and he provides this quote: "You're useful, you're doing good," and then it's just eventually you might just end up being abandoned. I think it's a lovely example of injuries in men, and oftentimes we think that guys should get past certain things, especially like relationship breakdowns, things that are happening quite commonly. We sort of think, but what we see with guys a lot of times is that they'll have these injuries, and these injuries accumulate over their life. And for a lot of older guys, they'll be accumulating injuries. The other thing that they tend to do is look interiorly. They try to look inward for trying to solve those problems. So this is just a really nice quote from 31-year-old Raj, and he talks about the trial and error. He knows he's got depressive symptoms. He knows he's battling with suicidality because he's got these thoughts around suicidal ideation. And he provides this picture of a lock, and he says, when the lock is still open, you can see that there's hope and you're less likely to suicide. If you don't know the combination, then you don't know how to get out of the depression and the suicide. But if if you know the combination, you're able to unlock. And he's talking to years of working with depressive symptoms and suicidality to try and unlock. And part of his unlock, as is the case for a lot of guys, is substance use. Either to get a little bit of respite from the pain that he's feeling, or a little bit of a break, and just to be able to connect with people in some way, or not. And so this interiority is a challenge for a lot of guys, because really what they're trying to do is suck it up, push it down, not to cry, but they lose touch with their feelings, and their recognition and management of distress are deeply impeded by this. The third I is about isolation. I love this quote. It's from a bloke called Eric. He's 28 years old and he's driving home from work. He works in an open space with 100 other people, but he's alone and he's deeply isolated. And he says, when I'm feeling suicidal, that's my darkest time. When it gets dark, when it's light and it starts getting dark and nobody's outside, it feels like you're the only person on earth. The social isolation is one of the biggest keys, for men. We know that when there's loneliness and social isolation, there's big risk factor in terms of suicidality and suicide itself. Far more eloquent than what I've just done is a paper that describes in detail this theory around injury, interiority, and isolation in men. We saw it time and time again with the American Journal of Men's Health there. Your own Paula Scribus, a really nice, media article here where he suggests that sometimes the crisis is just the result of long-term problems. Once the crisis is under control, the other long-term problems do not disappear and need to be addressed. And this is the biggest gaffe, he says, the ongoing help for people who have had suicidal thoughts for a long time or have recently attempted suicide or self-harm. And it really resonated with me, this article and this quote in particular, because a lot of times what we're trying to do is work with healthcare providers and services. In Canada, up to 60% of the men who suicide have accessed care, professional care, in the last 12 months. So it begs the question about, could we do a better job, or what should we be thinking about in terms of services? Way back in the day, in the early 2000s, we interviewed a bunch of international students, so young men, and we just wondered when we were talking to them if we might have been missing male depression. Time and again, they talked to us about becoming angry. You see this quote from a young man, 17-year-old, I will be really angry over little stuff. And I think it's really out of character because I'm more of a cheerful person. So anger sort of popped up in the transcripts all the time when we sort of spoke to guys. The other thing was like this concealment of depressive symptoms. Being depressed looks like a major liability, and kind of not like the person you'd want to go out with or to have as your wingman type thing. And so he talked to being at university, using a fair bit of alcohol, going out with friends to try and pass as being okay and doing the things that men typically do. We've spent a lot of time looking at the PHQ-9, and it's a common screen for depression used clinically. It's generic. It does a good job, no doubt. Has the one item there at the end that's around suicidal ideation. Very, very helpful. But we believe it doesn't capture male depression because we think that substance use, anger, and risk-taking are cardinal signs of expressions of depressive symptoms in men. That emotional suppression. I tried to ignore feeling down, that drug use, that alcohol use, the anger and aggression. It was difficult to manage my anger, the somatic symptoms. I've got unexplained aches and pains, and the risk-taking, stop caring about the consequences of my actions. So we've done some work with Simon Rice, who did an amazing PhD that looked at male depression risk scale. And the things that I've just mentioned about anger, irritability, alcohol overuse, risk-taking are all included in this survey questionnaire. It's not a clinical marker so much, but it's a great thing to be aware of, and we use it in a lot of research. And when we ran it against the PHQ-9, it showed really well in a population of Canadian men. So the psychometric values of the MDRS are comparable to the PHQ-9. and it actually identified proportionally more recent suicide attempts. I'm not saying, to throw out the PHQ-9, but I am saying I think we've got some really good evidence that men show up, especially early on, with very different kind of symptoms that we need to be cued to, that might reside outside of the ordinary things that we think about in terms of depression. I've just marked in red there the ones that relate to substance use. And again, oftentimes we risk mistaking substance use for actually depressive symptoms or the self-medication around those symptoms. We've also done some work with Zach Seidler out of Movember in Australia. And this one is called Men in Mind, and it's an online training program for mental health practitioners to enhance their competencies in working with male clients. Richly needed, really important. This one is freely available in Australia. They're going to roll it out to other markets, including the UK and Canada. I think it's just such a neat offering to try and help people, clinicians, work through what some of the nuances might be with guys when they show up in clinical practice. I'm going to try to share this video. Let's hope it works. Just give me 1 second here. And it showcases what the program is about.
During my years as a researcher and clinical psychologist, I've experienced both the ups and downs in trying to engage my male clients. At times, I felt completely powerless, watching them drop out of treatment and then come back years later in a crisis that really could have been averted. Because of this, I devoted the past several years to finding solutions for gaps in traditional treatment methods. It's about time we work out how we can adapt our way of working to stop men slipping through the cracks.
What if it's the very idea of trying to be a superhero that's making things more difficult for you? You seem like you're doing a pretty good job to me, and it's clear how much you care.
And when you're feeling really stressed and overwhelmed, it seems like it just narrows in to that one option. So what we want to do here is open that back up.
It's for my grandkids. I gotta get out of this mood so I can spend more quality time with them.
I know what that's like.
How could you have any idea what that's like? They're embarrassed by me. I know it.
There's nothing more to it. I'm burning up inside that she made me come when she's the one with the problem.
Truth is, I'm lonely.
I'm going to have to push through my own discomfort here and just ask. Were you thinking of killing yourself with the noose, Justin?
It's a great video that showcases an incredibly important program out of Movember, the Men in Mind program. Apologies. Just to say that Zach Seidler has done some great work and a few papers that just say, we often think about, whether guys prefer a male practitioner or a female practitioner. In the Australian results from this first paper, it showed that 60% don't care, 60% of men don't really care the sex of their practitioner. 20 do, 20% prefer male, 20% prefer female. And of those, the ones who prefer female were more severely depressed, and the ones who prefer male were non-heterosexual, were more likely to be non-heterosexual. Just super interesting. Again, we've looked at challenges working with men from the Australian therapist kind of points of view. They often talk to guys having a kind of a wavering commitment and engagement, that they're ill-equipped for therapy. And there's certainly a lot of elements of therapists being uncertain about how to work with men, especially around aggression. And this final one here about the Australian men's initial pathways into mental health services, really helpful. Anxiety and a family member were usually key pushers for young men accessing services, whereas relationships and work issues for older men were the issue that kind of got them into services, and oftentimes they would be self-directed in that work. We also have a tender in Australia where we're threading men's health research and clinical practice into university courses that train train healthcare professionals. And so this work is promising to help us equip at the undergraduate and graduate level folks who are going to be working in the mental health space, and to have a bit more of a cue and nuance towards guys. One of the other things that's worked really well for us, especially in Canada, is the e-space, and this one is called Heads Up Guys. It's run by John Agrasnichuk out of UBC Psychiatry. It's an amazing website. It's done really, really well. I won't play the video. It works with the idea of just putting in very plain language some of the things that guys bump up against in terms of depression. There's also these kind of action calls. We know that guys tend to like to do something that's tangible and feels real for them. And so we've got practical tips and reaching out, and there's a list of professional services as well, and designing your own action plan. Sort of different modules around sleep and stress management, social life, physical activity, food, sex and relationships. It's worked really well. And in terms of, academic products that are built, this one really would be amongst, I think, one of the most highly visited. It's more than 60,000 visits a month. It's super interesting because it's run over 6 years. It hasn't really had many changes. The colours are literally the same as when it started. People do come back to it, but there's a lot of drive and a lot of interest in guys and women coming to this website for help. The biggest traffic comes from the United States, then the United Kingdom, and then Canada, where it's housed. But these numbers are very, very impressive over a long period of time. What people search for, or what guys search for when they come to the site, the vast majority, even though this site is dealing with depression and depressive symptoms, it's oftentimes that it's suicidal thoughts or elements around suicide that are bringing people in to have a look. We published an analytics from this work, and it is super interesting to know that there's been an increase in the users over time. 1 in 7 are return visitors. For people who are signed into their account, 50% of them are men and 50% are women. Suicidality is the driver, in which I just sort of mentioned. And we do this piece where we look at conversion. So there's a self-check where we run the PHQ-9 and collect some data there, and then publish from that data as a help-seeking kind of look at guys coming to the website. 78% of them show moderate depression and 58% suicidal ideation who are coming to this site. And this is 50-odd thousand guys a month. And the stress test is also run, and about 53% of them complete that. So again, just to say, it's getting a lot of traction, a lot of interest. It's been well established. It's 6 years later, and it still seems to be growing. So again, just another offering to help us think about, the ways that we could refer and guide people, guys especially, around the depressive symptoms. I think there's always blind spots around men's depression and suicidality, and certainly relationships is one of them. Movember asked us to do some work about looking at, men building better relationships. Reason being that guys who go through separation and divorce are 8 times more likely to suicide than women who go through that same transition. And also in Canada, for guys who do divorce, they're 3 to 4 times more likely than the general male population to suicide. So we were super interested in better understanding men's relationships. Reason being, we know that when relationships are good, men live longer, they have better quality of life. But we know conversely, when relationships are distressed, there's a lot of mental health challenges for guys within that context. We also sort of recognise that guys, the template for learning how to have a successful relationship has never really been there. You might have observed things with your own parents or your own father, but it wouldn't necessarily transcend to the generation that you were growing up to. and also the relationship that you're in. So we sort of had this feeling that relationships kind of happen to men a lot of times, rather than them having really clear intent around what they want from the relationship and what their goals are, relationship plans. And the vast majority of work, at least in Canada and Australia, is done in the domestic violence and the intimate partner violence space, where it's corrective. There's very little upstream about helping men build relationships. Don't know how it is in Lithuania, but our divorce rate and separation rate during COVID has been astronomical. It's grown tenfold. It's been really big, and part of the issue here is that people were locked down in confined quarters, not being able to really get out, created a lot of problems. So in terms of timing, the issues around divorce rates and distressed relationships is really high. So we started the Men Building Better Relationships project. We spoke to 50 guys who'd gone through a relationship breakup. We spoke to 30 practitioners who provide services for men. We heard time and time again that men need to do some work on themselves. They need to figure out who they are in terms of identity before they get into a relationship, that notion of being successful with a me, then we approach. A lot of times the breakups were epiphanies for guys working out around, a lot of mental health challenges as the epiphany for then doing some work to get better at their deficiencies that occurred within the relationship. There's also the main thing that guys talked to us about was communication, and this notion of having regular check-ins with their partner to actually track the relationship, not just what's going on in and around the relationship. Seems really fundamental, but a lot of the guys learnt that the hard way through breakups and pretty distressed relationships. It was interesting also that the nature of the care that the guys accessed was not just professional care. A lot of times it related to things around friends and family, and talking through that, but also the internet was a big provider of a place, at least, where guys went looking for different services to try and help them in and after their relationships. We've published 4 papers from those interviews. They're very, very fresh in terms of, only come out this year. But just to say, we discovered a lot in terms of mental illness, certainly a lot of challenges where guys would be going into a relationship carrying a mental illness, depression, suicidality, anxiety, and that putting additional pressure on the relationship. So it wasn't always a cause and effect where the relationship got distressed and then the mental health issues emerged. Oftentimes they're carrying some things in, and that was because the same could be said for partners as well. So some of the challenges, some of the complexities of relationships. Emotions are super interesting. When we talk to guys about emotions, some of us would think that alexithymia is the issue where guys don't, sort of articulate what's going on for them. But many of these guys had difficulty deciphering exactly what it is they were feeling in a way that they could express it in some other avenue other than anger. And so it was very interesting to sort of think about, how we think about emotions with guys and how we, want to work with them to be better at expressing. The help seeking I mentioned, in that other paper, and we've just got one that's coming out next week where guys who have been dumped, so the partner initiated breakup, and what we did a narrative analysis on this, and it just showed a lot of guys withdraw within a relationship. Other guys take up the argument as a long-standing piece, but they're in past narratives. And I think there's a real opportunity here for narrative therapy, where we might think about these guys breaking these narratives and getting more into the space of doing the work, the self-help work that they need to do often after a relationship. Just to say, we write these papers and the majority of them, get read 8 times or cited a few times. What was good about some of this work was this one in particular around men's mental illness drew a lot of interest. And on Reddit, there was over 2,100 comments where people had read the paper and had things to say. And many of those testimonies from guys resonated with the findings of this. So I think it's interesting that, relationships are something that, the sanctity of relationships, we don't always talk about them, but increasingly there's a willingness to sort of discuss how to be better in relationships. So again, we're working with Movember to build a program. It's called Movember Relationships. It's trying to get at helping guys develop skills around relationships. So we're expecting that we'll sort of unleash this, so to speak, in the Australian market and probably about halfway through next year. So we're just in the building phase, having done the research on this side of it. I'm really looking forward to trying to help guys just sort of work through some of the challenges that go with distress, and also relationships that end, which is about a third of them, but also, building some skills up front. I think COVID's been interesting. I've mentioned it a little bit. We've known for the longest time that distressed relationships, transitions, and pressure on money are cardinal issues, really significant for guys, and certainly in terms of depression and suicide rates. So again, we did this study, it showed up, 79% of the guys who completed the survey that we put through, said their mental health had been negatively affected by COVID. 51% reported moderate financial stress, and just under half of the 183 respondents indicated suicidal ideation. I don't think that it's wise to wait for the suicide rates post-pandemic to say that there's going to be problems with mental health. I think that we're well established here, in terms of knowing that anxiety and depression rates are up. And we would imagine that the suicide rates might follow. Hopefully not. But there's a lot of work to be done. And in terms of timing, I don't think there's ever been a point in history where we've been under more pressure to do more to help people through what have been really, really difficult transitions. And I certainly don't think we're done yet in terms of coming out of COVID, but also the financial issues that are coming up in many, many countries and indeed across the world. I won't play this video. It just talks to the idea that we should be able to help people out. I often get asked by people, clinicians and the public alike, they say, what should I do if I'm worried about a guy in my life? And this might not be new for many of you, but I love the acronym. It's called ALEC. This is from November, and they say ask. Ask how the guy's feeling, give him the opportunity to talk, listen, give it your full attention. You don't have to solve guys' problems. You can just encourage action. You might ask them what's worked for them in the past. Are they getting enough sleep? Those real general questions to encourage the conversation. Many of the guys that we speak to and we interview, they're speaking to us about issues that they haven't had the permission to talk about in other forums. And this ALEC piece does give that rubric of how we might approach it. And I think vitally important when we do talk with guys and we offer that opportunity to chat and work through some things is that we check back in with them. Because time and time again with guys, they'll disclose things, they'll talk, and then they'll feel quite embarrassed about having done it. So it's really key to check back in and be able to have that conversation, continue that conversation, and norm it in ways where the guy doesn't feel slighted by having discussed things. It's a pretty simple rubric, but I really do like it, and we use it a lot. Just to say, we do a lot of community-based work in Canada. It is the home of the social determinants of health in many ways, right back to the Ottawa Charter in 76. And we do have some ideas about what works for men in the space. This one is the Dudes Club. We have a large Indigenous population in Canada, actually more Indigenous population than Australia. And many of those fellows suffer shortened life expectancy. They have a lot of challenges around socioeconomic status, including substance use, homelessness. And the Dudes Club runs at one of our more impoverished downtown sites in Vancouver, where guys come in every fortnight, every 2 weeks. They're given a meal, they get a haircut, And the mantra is to leave your armour at the door and to be able to talk about things that are going on in your life. So it's a social connection kind of piece. It's so interesting because it's happening in a medical clinic where they've made space. And now this is now in more than 30 sites across Canada, this absolute, gem of a community-based program. Really amazing work done there. In the US, the black men's barber shops have worked really well because they're places where guys ordinarily go. And many of the barbers have been trained just to ask a few questions, open-ended questions about how guys are tracking. They've also run the blood sugar levels and the blood pressure pieces out of some of these barber shops. So again, just kind of that conduit to getting guys to engage with elements of their health, which is really important. UBC is a veteran-friendly campus. We have a lot of guys and women who come back from active service or reserves, and they come into university. And we also run the Veterans Transition Program out of the University of British Columbia. It is for guys who are coming back from active service and reacclimatising to civilian life. It's counselling psychology. We would never call it that. We're really careful to call it a Veterans Transition Program. We talk about dropping your baggage, releasing. So the words and the concepts that are used are familiar. I'm not sure about the ethics of this, but many of these guys are recruited to the program by saying, hey, you're fine, but the guys at the group could really do with your expertise and your help. And oftentimes that will bring guys in because it appeals to the military code. Just a great example. I know that there's another example coming up today. We're talking about mates in construction, and I think that's really important to think about occupation and the ways that we channel and meet guys, where they work. This one is men's sheds. It's been very popular in Australia because the government threw a ton of cash behind it and built these sheds. We've battled a little bit in Canada because there's no money for it and it's run on volunteers. But we do have 30-some sheds, and what they are is a premises where guys can get together and focus on a project. It might be woodwork, it might be gardening, it might be some element of building something. And these are shoulder-to-shoulder experiences where the guys will often be doing something and the talk just naturally evolves around health, but it's also the social connection that these guys get. So oftentimes retired guys going through bereavement, divorce, unemployment, those sorts of things. Often, guys can go to this on a volunteer basis and it works really well. The other one I just mentioned, we often disaggregate, different diseases. We've got prostate cancer support groups in Canada, 100 strong across the country. They're volunteer run, and they bring guys into a space where they can work with peers to better understand the journey that might be in front of them and decide, some of the key decisions. We know that anxiety and depression is very, very high in this group. Their risk factors are much higher because they're older men, but also because they're carrying oftentimes comorbidities along with the prostate cancer. So just to say, there's many, many things that are happening in the community in Canada, and I'd say Australia for that matter, where we're doing a really nice job of bridging to services and making them available, but also offering some services there that can make a difference and take a bit of pressure off the professional traditional services. I'll close out with six concluding words. That would be, we believe there's a discordant relationship in men because they are diagnosed at half the rate of women with depression and they suicide at 3 to 4 times the rate. We think there's a difference in how they show up clinically. We think that they will often show up angry, irritable, with substance use issues, with risk-taking, over-involvement in sports and work, we often see as well. We think there's diversity also in the category of men. So I haven't belaboured it today, but to say, Indigenous men have far shorter life expectancies, higher rates in some pockets of Canada, related to isolation, loneliness, substance use. Also, LGBTQ or gay and bisexual blokes, a lot of times their rates of suicidality will be higher. So there's diversity within the category of men when we talk about depression, suicidality. I think, there's still massive amounts of shame that go with mental illness for guys. Every time we think we're sort of making some headway to norm the conversation, we get these stories of guys who silently suffered through their depressive symptoms and unfortunately ended up with a dire outcome of suicide. So again, there is a lot of shame wrapped up in this. The stigma is huge, and we often talk about societal stigma. And I think Canada's been really good at being able to create the space to have a conversation around anxiety, around depression. But it's the self-stigma that oftentimes undoes a lot of men. So the things that they carry in terms of how they perceive they should be as a man, self-reliant, able to look after your own problems, grit, resilience, can be really tough on guys, and they can be very hard on themselves in terms of not measuring up. The final one is social isolation. I think if COVID taught us anything, it's about the value of being connected. And, social isolation is such a hard one. We often thought of social isolation as the lonely guy in the corner with no mates, but it's much more complex than that. We see guys who get isolated within company. We see people who are isolated without, social supports. Super important to think about, those structures that also are at play here with guys. There's more details in an article that's been really popular, this one with current psychiatry reports. It kind of gives an eloquent overview of what I've just, staccatoed through, but it does a nice job of giving an up-to-date feel for the field, and it does talk in depth about the depressive symptoms I've been talking about and the risk for male depression. My final point is just to say that for the longest time I've been doing work in men, and I still get asked on occasion about why not women. It's such an interesting space. We've always believed that the work that we do with men, if we can intervene to help their outcomes, we think it will help everybody. We think it will help the women in their lives, the kids, other men. And this picture is just a lovely illustration of that. It's from a mum who lost her son to suicide. And it's one of the most powerful images that I think we've had submitted to us. And it's just a really strong, poignant reminder that when we do make a difference to guys, we make a difference to everybody. I've never seen, a depressive symptom in guys or a suicide where it's not affected a myriad of people around them. So it's just, if we do the work well in terms of men's mental health, we stand a really good chance of getting gains much wider than what we think, in terms of just the population of guys. Again, we run a social media. We curate about 40% of what we do, and about 60% is our own stuff. It helps to keep up to date with the things that we do. We'd love for you to follow us. A shout out to UBC and University of Melbourne, the Canada Research Chairs in Movember for making my life a bit more interesting and being able to do this amazing work. And likewise, thank you, Paulus, for the opportunity of speaking today and opening things up for us. Thank you.
Thank you, dear John, for really impressive work and amazing presentation. When we wanted to seek a presenter, and we were recommended of you, we saw the extensive amount of research you have done, and the experience which you had speaking with a lot of different communities, different cultures. It's really impressive. We have a couple of questions, so if you have still some energy,
sure.
Okay, so one question would be about healthcare, about improving healthcare. How could we improve healthcare so that the traditional help provided when people have some difficulties could be more applied for men, for men needs?
Yeah, I think, I think if we think about depression a little bit differently, like in terms of when a guy shows up, it's so interesting. Oftentimes guys will talk to us, they'll use the word stress. They won't use the word depression. So sometimes guys will show up and they'll be like, been really stressed. And then those follow-up questions just to kind of ask, so can you say a bit more about that? What's that about? I think it just opens up the conversation. I would just say that when guys have a sense of they've got permission to speak, they do. But we can easily shut them down with closed-ended questions, yes, no answers. And I think that if we just open them up a little bit, we can go a long way, towards helping get the conversations and better understanding why they might be there. Because the amount of guys that show up with somatic, problems that might actually be, something else. And one of the interesting ones too, I'd just say, we've been doing so much work in relationships. I don't think many clinicians ask about a guy's relationship, and I think it's actually one of the blind spots. So I think we might ask about sexual health, but we rarely kind of get into, it's kind of that privacy piece. But I do think when we ask those open-ended questions, I think it can really help to just help us make better assessments. So that would be one of the things I'd say, that could really help in terms of tailoring our approach to speaking with guys when they do have the courage to show up.
Yeah. Okay, so it seems that it's important to listen to the way men are, to invite them for the open dialogue without some words or invitations which could increase distance.
Right. Yeah. And just be cued to the language.
Yeah.
So, the language and the just the context. So yeah, I think I think we could be really, really good at it if we just. And it's not about time. It's just about, like you say, it's just that kind of listening for those cues. Yeah, because they are there.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple more questions. One would be, is there any positives when men provide help for men? There are some discussions about that. So what would be your opinion?
I think it's so interesting to me because the guys we speak to would do anything to help another guy. Like they're totally, if a guy had a problem, they would so be happy to help. They'd be there to listen. They'd be the wingman. They'd do all of those things because it's a masculine virtue, right? To have your friends back, to be good for other people. That's a virtue and a value. Guys do that really well. The disjuncture is the challenge of reaching out. So there's this reticence to reach out, and sometimes there's a reticence to ask if someone's okay because we don't want to disrupt their independence and their self-reliance. So short answer, yes, I think it's really important. It's not simple work. We have to be able to be courageous enough to explicitly ask, hey, I've noticed you've been a bit flat lately. Are you okay? What's going on for you? To get into those spaces and to do that. But also, when we're not traveling well, to reach out to a friend to say, hey, things just aren't going too good for me. I think there's great opportunity, but we have to just break through that little barrier that goes both ways. Yeah, that's the challenge.
If I'm not mistaken, there is a saying that men help each other working shoulder to shoulder.
Correct. Yeah, and we think that in a lot, the one of the ones I put up there about men's sheds, we think that happens a lot because it takes the emotion out of it. It's like you usually shoulder to shoulder, you just no direct eye contact. You might just be talking and you might be doing something else. You might be having a drink or whatever. But it's like, yeah, there's this kind of, there's nothing confronting about it. And if some emotion slips out, it's not going to be, it's going to be protected at some level. So yeah, we see guys all the time, shoulder to shoulder. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think we have another related question about the way how specialists could help men to accept their difficulties and seek for help. I think in a way you kind of answered that by speaking how we should speak with men, how we should address, but if there's anything more you would like to add?
Yeah, just to say that at the front end, when I tell the vulnerability story and I relate it to, how we've got celebrity who are saying, who are doing vulnerability publicly, and then we've got this other discourse that's shutting it down. I think we need to be really careful in norming. We all got vulnerabilities. We all do. And we have to be really normative in the frame that there's no hidden agenda for when we are vulnerable and are willing to say we're vulnerable. So I just think that we need to stay the course there and open up the possibilities and loosen the restrictions that were around. Well, and some of them are still around, but certainly in the late 90s into the 2000s, there are a lot of restrictive notions about what it was to be a man, and that weakness would be associated with any level of mental health challenge. And I just think we need to norm the frame that vulnerabilities happen for everyone. And again, COVID, I just say, when I talk to guys now, they know what I'm talking about. When I'm talking about depression and anxiety, they definitely know. Everyone has had a touch of it over the last couple of years, because we've all gone through something that's been a pretty tough transition.
Yeah. So could we say that a strong person is not one who is invulnerable, but who accepts that he is and can be vulnerable?
Yeah. The strength might be in speaking up.
Yeah. I guess we have time for the last question. Really, thank you for answering these questions. What would help men to accept their liabilities as mental illnesses, or shift the attitude towards themselves for the better in areas like relationships, self-worth, etc.?
Yeah. So good. So it might sound a little bit Pollyanna and a bit trope, but we often talk to guys about not comparing themselves to others, like thinking about their personal bests, thinking about what they value, what they're hoping for, what they're visualizing, their goals, and not getting caught in the competitiveness that oftentimes characterizes men, especially men around other men. So oftentimes we're super competitive, and we sort of try to talk about being a bit more in your own lane and thinking about what's good for you, and working towards those personal bests, right? So again, it sounds simple, but a lot of guys get caught in what they don't have. And the idea is to try and help them conceptualize what they do have, but also what they want, not in comparison to other people so much, but for a productive life. And a lot of times guys do accept that they've got these debilitating states, and they find their way through with meaning for their life. Hard to do if you're comparing to someone else who doesn't carry the challenges that you do, but sometimes it's just about trying to contextualize it in these guys' lives and help them bridge, help them make those transitions, you know, and not comparing themselves to all the celebrity. And I think we've just been speaking to some guys 19 to 44 years of age, and they, you know, they talk about social media undoing them because they see so many things that they will never be. And I just think it's a great reminder that we just need to make the village a bit smaller and just think about, you know, our own personal goals, you know.
Yeah, exactly. John, really, really thank you for being here today. We wish you further success in working with this topic and understanding it. Really happy that you accepted our invitation.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Okay, see you.